Welcome to Obscure Chronicle. Tonight a hush hangs in the air. Rain taps the window in a steady rhythm, blurring the world beyond to candlelit shadows. The light from a single flame flickers on chipped plaster, sending wavering patterns up walls that have held more secrets than voices. There's a chill on the floorboards, as if the room remembers nights of uncertainty and distant thunder. August 24th, 1814. Washington City sits on the edge of the continent, young and uneasy, its streets muddy and restless beneath a sky thick with the weight of summer storms. The war has dragged on too long, leaving behind rumours, worry, and the sense that something is approaching, something no one can quite name. On this evening, the city feels suspended. Neighbours close their shutters early, whispering about the distant crack of musket fire. In the President's house, Dolley Madison stands near the tall windows, fingers pressed to the cool glass. She scans the horizon for any sign of her husband's return, or perhaps a warning that danger has finally come too close. The wind brings a scent both sweet and sharp. Garden roses from the grounds, mingled with the faintest trace of smoke. Horses stamp uneasily in their stalls, and church bells remain silent, as if waiting for someone to break the spell. The usual order of the capital seems to falter, replaced by a quiet expectancy, a city holding its breath. Beyond the city's edge, the British army advances. Boots leave deep prints in the wet earth. Lanterns swing at the end of a long poles, lighting the path through tangled woods and fields left untended by war. In their wake, stories will grow, of warnings that never reach the right ears, of panic stilled only by exhaustion, of a night when the world shifted and the White House itself became a silent witness to flame. Tonight, we look back on the hours before the fire, when hope, fear, and the weight of history pressed in from all sides, when the question still lingered, what truly remains after a city burns? And as we step into that night together, if you find yourself drawn into these forgotten shadows, please leave a like, subscribe for the next chapter, and share your thoughts below. Thank you for listening, and enjoy. The city did not sleep well on the night before disaster. Washington in 1814 was hardly the capital of dreams. It was a patchwork of muddy lanes, low wooden bridges, half-built monuments, and fragile hopes. The Potomac drifted quietly past, thick with August humidity. Every window seemed to watch the river, uncertain of what tide it might carry. Horses whickered in restless stables. Dogs barked, sensing the unease that comes before a storm, any kind of storm. Inside these narrow streets, the people of Washington played their parts, perhaps as if life could go on unbroken. But that summer, war pressed close on every side. The War of 1812, a conflict already 2 years old, had found new momentum in the British. Their fleet, bold and unchallenged, had landed forces on American soil once again. Whispers trickled through taverns and markets. The British are coming. Some shrugged and poured another drink. Others bolted doors, glancing over shoulders at every footfall in the dusk. President James Madison was not a large man, but he wore the burdens of his office with quiet gravity. That morning, he had met his cabinet in the President's house, a structure less grand than it sounds, still raw with new paint and unfinished rooms. They spoke in tight, uncertain voices about the British march on Bladensburg, a small town just miles from the city's edge. There was no consensus, only nervous conjecture. Would the enemy turn, or would they come straight for the heart? Dolley Madison, the First Lady, prepared herself for the unknown. She was known for her poise, her keen sense of ceremony, her ability to draw warmth from even the bleakest moment. That morning she ordered the silver packed away and made careful notes in her journal about the rooms and their treasures, the tall velvet drapes, the elegant French chairs, the painting of General Washington that gazed out over the parlour. She moved with purpose, her steps echoing softly through empty hallways. Servants carried messages and meals, their faces tight with worry. In the kitchen, pots clanged a little too loudly. On the upper floors, chambermaids peered out at the sky, trying to read the shifting light. Some prayed, quietly. Others worked in silence, each movement deliberate, heavy with unspoken questions. The air inside the house felt close, as if every room was holding its breath. Beyond the grounds, the city was a collection of anxious corners. Shopkeepers lingered behind counters, watching the street with narrowed eyes. In the market square, talk rose and fell like the tides. A few men argued that the capital could never fall. Others, older and more cautious, remembered how quickly fortune can turn in war. Children played in the mud, their games strangely subdued, their laughter clipped and wary. Late in the afternoon, a messenger galloped into the city, his coat streaked with dust and sweat. He carried word from Bladensburg. The British were near, their lines advancing under a haze of gun-smoke and sun. His arrival sent ripples through every household. Some packed hurried bags, others gathered by candlelight, waiting for news that might never come. The air grew thick with rumour and dread. That evening, James Madison rode out to join the American lines. He left quietly with little ceremony. His advisers cautioned him to remain in the city, but he insisted on seeing the men who would defend it. His horse picked its way through muddy lanes as the last gold light slipped behind the trees. The city watched him go, its leader vanishing into the grey, leaving behind a house that seemed suddenly too large, too empty. In the president's house, Dolly waited by the window, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She listened for hoofbeats, for the call of a familiar voice in the dusk. She felt the weight of history press against the glass. Somewhere in the night she heard thunder, distant and uncertain. It might have been a storm or the first faint sound of cannon. Somewhere down Pennsylvania Avenue lanterns flickered behind curtains. In one house, an old man sat by the fire, polishing a musket he had carried since another war. In another, a young woman stitched quietly, her needle rising and falling with anxious rhythm. Farther out, sentries paced along crude earthworks, their shadows stretching long and thin in the uncertain light. Rumours filled the night air, some wild, others far too plausible. It was said that the British would show no mercy, that they meant to make an example of Washington. Others insisted the enemy would bypass the city, turning instead for Baltimore or Annapolis. The truth was hard to grasp, slippery as mist. In that uncertain hour, anything seemed possible. Midnight passed with no alarms. The city, if it slept, did so lightly. Some houses kept lamps burning through the darkness. In those pale hours, Dolley Madison took pen in hand and wrote a brief letter to her sister. "I am accordingly ready," she wrote. "I have pressed as many cabinet papers into trunks as to fill one carriage." Her hand was steady, though her heart must have fluttered. She gave quiet orders to the servants. "Gather what you can, be ready to flee." Still, she waited, hoping against hope for word of her husband's return. In the distance, the British army marched through the trees, torches throwing red light across the undergrowth. General Robert Ross, who commanded the expedition, rode in silence, his face marked by fatigue and resolve. His men, veterans of campaigns in Europe, eyed the American capital with a mixture of anticipation and caution. They had orders: punish the city, show the flag, break the spirit of a young nation. But as the city lights winked through the darkness, there must have been a pause, a brief wondering silence at what lay ahead. By the time dawn crept over Washington, the city felt both changed and unchanged. The houses still stood, the river still ran. But beneath every routine, a current of fear pulled at the edges. The day that would end in fire had begun in uncertainty, quiet footsteps, and the persistent gnawing question: would help come, or would this be the day the city fell? It is easy now to imagine the city as doomed from the start. But in those hours, hope and dread were tangled like vines, no one certain which would outgrow the other. The bells remained silent, the river kept its secrets. Even as the first rays of sunlight pierced the haze, most in Washington clung to the fragile idea that there would be another night, another meal, another hour safe from the coming storm. In the president's house, Dolley Madison took a last walk through the halls, touching the polished banisters, running her hand along the cool marble. She paused in front of Washington's portrait, gazing up at the face that had seen another revolution, another kind of uncertainty. Outside, the city stirred and braced itself, every sound a reminder of the thin line between ordinary life and the sudden, irretrievable loss that history sometimes demands. That morning, the stage was set. The last quiet day had ended. What would follow would burn itself into memory and myth, reshaping the nation's story in the smoke and silence that lingered long after the flames died away. Dawn arrived wrapped in haze. In the half-light, the city looked unchanged, a scattering of white columns and red brick, shrouded in the uncertain quiet of late August. Yet beneath this surface, something restless simmered. There was no warning bell, no rallying cry that carried across the rooftops. News travelled in fragments, riding on anxious breaths and hurried footsteps, not on any official proclamation. The city's heart beat in odd, uneven rhythms. President Madison's absence was felt most keenly in these hours. With the cabinet scattered, authority diluted, and military leadership divided, the city's fate seemed to rest on a series of unanswered questions. Who would give the order to defend? Who would remain if all else failed? There was a peculiar emptiness to the halls of power, a sense that decisions were being made somewhere else, or not at all. On the edges of the city, soldiers dug in where they could. Volunteers from Maryland and the district gathered in ragged lines at Bladensburg, not far from the city's boundary. Their uniforms were mismatched, muskets battered, bayonets gleaming dully in the early sun. Most had not fired a shot in anger. The air was thick with apprehension, the grass wet with dew and the memory of old rain. It was there, just past the morning's haze, that the British force emerged. Disciplined, silent, a ribbon of red and white advancing with steady purpose. Led by General Ross, they moved like a tide, faces drawn, boots caked with mud from days of marching. The glint of their sabres caught what little sun broke through the clouds. There was no pageantry in this advance, only a grim, methodical certainty. The battle itself, if it can be called a battle, was over almost before it began. The American lines wavered. Some fired a volley and fell back, others broke ranks and ran, confusion blossoming like weeds along the riverbank. In the space of an hour, the defence of Washington had dissolved. The noise of gunfire faded quickly, replaced by the trample of boots and the harsh calls of officers trying to restore order. Somewhere in the smoke, Madison himself witnessed the collapse. urging retreat and dispatching what orders he could. His voice, so often steady, was nearly lost in the chaos. Back in the city, word spread not in shouts but in whispers. Servants ran from house to house, relaying stories half heard, half guessed. Shopkeepers bolted doors and hid beneath counters. Mothers gathered their children, pressing them close in the dim corners of parlours. The markets emptied. The sound of carts and hooves on the avenues became an anxious, fevered drum. No one knew which streets might offer safety, or if any truly would. There was a sense of abandonment, a vacuum where leadership should have stood. Some officials fled. A few, braver or more stubborn, tried to organise resistance, gathering a handful of militiamen and telling them to hold fast. Most saw the futility in their eyes. The British force, larger and more experienced, moved through the outskirts almost unhindered. Inside the President's house, the tension deepened. Dolley Madison received word that the enemy was near, closer than anyone had guessed. She could hear the city's fear in the hurried steps of the staff, in the abrupt silences that followed every knock at the door. She pressed cabinet documents into trunks, made a last circuit of the staterooms, and waited. She waited for her husband, for the promise of help, for the comfort of certainty that would never quite arrive. Elsewhere, families made their own decisions. Some loaded wagons with what little they could carry, setting out for the countryside, moving as quietly as possible beneath the uncertain sky. Others chose to remain, locking doors, lowering shades, trusting to thick brick and prayer. Each act of preparation felt both brave and desperate. Choices made not with hope, but with the resignation that comes when there are no good options left. By midday, the British entered Washington proper. There was no formal surrender, no meeting between commanders. The city was simply taken, almost as if it had been abandoned to its fate. Soldiers moved from building to building, methodical and unhurried, their orders clear. A strange silence fell over the avenues, broken only by the creak of wagon wheels, the sharp report of a musket fired in warning, the occasional scream that split the heat like lightning. Some citizens watched from behind curtains, barely daring to breathe. They saw uniforms unlike any they had known, red coats, tall shakos, the clatter of British kit. Some soldiers paused to stare back at the faces in the windows, perhaps seeing not enemies but fellow wanderers caught in an impossible hour. Others ignored the onlookers, intent on their orders. There was little looting at first, little destruction. It was as if the invaders were taking the measure of the city, walking its length, waiting for a signal none could name. Dolley Madison, still in the President's house, was among the last to remain. Her determination, so often noted, was tested now beyond measure. She stood in the drawing-room and listened for the approach of horses on the avenue. She could sense the city's terror rising, a low and steady thrum beneath every other sound. The staff urged her to flee, their voices rising in desperation. Finally, as the enemy drew too near to ignore, she agreed. She gathered a few lost belongings, her husband's papers, some silver, and above all, the portrait of General Washington that had watched over so many uncertain days. When she departed, the house was left in eerie stillness. Tables remained set, the scent of recent meals still hanging in the air. The great portrait, removed from its frame, was carried into the night by those who risked their safety to save a fragment of history. The doors were shut softly behind her, the echo lingering long after she was gone. The British found the President's house empty but for a few lingering servants. They entered quietly, almost respectfully at first. Soldiers wandered the rooms, examining furnishings, peering at the oddities of American statehood. French mirrors, English porcelain, letters half written and left behind in haste. Some sat at the long dining table, where a meal meant for another night waited untouched. The food was still warm. Glasses of wine stood at every place. There was a strange intimacy in that moment. Conquerors seated at the table of the conquered, their laughter low, their voices carrying softly through the corridors. But respect did not last. The order was given: burn the public buildings, punish the seat of American government, make of this place a lesson and a warning. The soldiers gathered oil, wood, whatever would burn. Flames licked the drapes and climbed the walls. The scent of smoke rose sharply, mixing with the perfume of roses still drifting in from the gardens. The fire's light spilled out onto the avenue, painting the columns in orange and red, throwing monstrous shadows onto the lawn. Throughout the city the same pattern repeated. No warning, no mercy. The Capitol, the Treasury, every symbol of American hope was marked for destruction. Fire bloomed on rooftops. Windows shattered in the heat. The sounds of looting and shouting drifted through the smoke, blending with the cries of those who mourned what could not be saved. Yet even in the chaos, there were moments of quiet. In the alleyways, survivors clung to one another, listening to the distant roar of burning timber. In the gardens behind the White House, dew still clung to the grass, unmoved by the violence. The Potomac rolled on, reflecting the fire back at the city that had risen too quickly and fallen just as fast. By nightfall, the city was changed forever. The British held its heart in their hands and nothing remained untouched. The memory of that day would linger in the ash, in the silence that settled over broken walls and scorched earth. It would become legend, repeated, reshaped, softened and sharpened by every retelling. Somewhere, beneath the weight of smoke and memory, the question echoed still. What does it mean when no one comes to save you? She stood alone in the tall sunlit room, fingers tracing the grain of a mahogany sideboard. Beyond the windows the world seemed both suspended and impossibly urgent. Each breath Dolley Madison drew felt measured, borrowed from a future she could no longer see. The city around her had grown smaller, huddled behind smoke and dread. Inside the president's house, every sound was amplified. The scrape of a chair leg, the shiver of glass in a sudden gust, the distant, relentless drum of boots on the avenue. She was no stranger to the burdens of ceremony. From the first days of her husband's presidency, Dolly had fashioned order from uncertainty. She filled the mansion with music and laughter, with polished silver and the aroma of orange blossoms. She drew the lonely and the ambitious together, smoothing over quarrels, inventing traditions that felt old the moment they began. Her presence anchored the rooms, lending a borrowed grandeur to walls that still smelled of paint and promise. Now, all of that seemed brittle. She moved through the chambers, not as hostess or first lady, but as a woman on the edge of retreat. Her staff hovered in uneasy knots, voices dropping to whispers when she passed. The air trembled with rumours. Some said the British were already at the edge of the city. Others insisted there would be a last-minute defence, that reinforcements would rally, that fate would turn once more in America's favour. Dolly heard each story, weighed every hope, and found herself growing stiller inside. On a narrow table near the north wall rested the few treasures she could not bear to abandon. Her husband's letters, a Bible with the binding cracked, the delicate blue porcelain cup she favoured for morning chocolate. She glanced at these objects, counting what was irreplaceable. Yet above all, it was the portrait of George Washington that commanded her attention. He gazed down from his gilded frame, severe and oddly gentle, the nation's first guardian, his painted eyes steady and grave. It was not only a symbol of the past, it was the anchor of the country's story. The painting had watched over peace and discord, treaties and heartbreak, long evenings of celebration, and the thick silence of defeat. Dolley knew the British would seek it out, knew that if they could, they would parade it through the ruined streets as a trophy, a sign of the nation's collapse. She could not let that happen. She called her staff together in the east parlour. The room was heavy with light and tension. Some faces were pale with exhaustion, others gleamed with sweat. Dolley's voice was quiet, the sort of calm that comes after a long night of fear. She gave her orders gently, asking the men to help her remove the portrait from its place. The frame, heavy and ornate, was impossible to fit through the doors. So, with careful hands, they pried the canvas free, rolling it loosely, wrapping it in cloth. Dolley watched, lips pressed tight, heart drumming. The moment seemed to stretch, each movement an act of preservation, a promise to the memory of a nation. They gathered a few more items, important documents, silverware, cherished books. In hurried voices the staff debated how best to transport the treasures. It was a scene at once frantic and hushed, as if every tick of the clock might signal the enemy's approach. The noise outside rose and fell, a shifting chorus of uncertainty. At times it was distant, the occasional shout, the clatter of a wagon, the slow thunder of horses somewhere far off. Then it would surge, pressing close, bootsteps echoing down the avenue, a sudden volley of musket fire that snapped the calm in two. Each new sound brought Dolley to the window, searching for some sign that her husband was near, or that the British had finally breached the last invisible line. She made her choices quickly. The city was crumbling, and history was moving with a speed she could scarcely grasp. She wrote a note to her sister, Anna Cutts, her handwriting precise despite the chaos swirling just outside the walls. Our kind friend Mr. Carroll has come to hasten my departure. He promises to see my portrait safe. It was Mr. Jacob Barker and Robert G.L. de Peyster, friends of the family, who ultimately removed the painting, ensuring it would not fall into British hands. They carried it into the night, their figures blending into the chaos, disappearing as quickly as they had come. Dolley thanked them softly, her gratitude contained in a look more than words. Other artifacts were left behind, drapes fluttering in the hall, books scattered on reading tables, letters still open beside half-empty inkwells. There is something particularly haunting about an interrupted domestic scene, a room abandoned in the middle of ordinary life. Dolley glanced once more at the silver tray left on a side table, the chessboard poised mid-game, the clock that ticked on regardless of history. The house felt both too large and suddenly too small. Each chamber was filled with memory, but emptied of future. Dolley paused on the threshold, taking in the hush that had settled over her world. Outside, the evening pressed close, dense with smoke, rumours, and the possibility of violence. She gathered her gloves, tucked her husband's letters into a small valise, and nodded to the last of the staff. "We must go," she said, voice low but certain. "Now, while we still have the chance." There was no pageantry, no final flourish, only a slow closing of doors, the quiet tread of shoes on marble, and the collective exhale of a house left in the hands of strangers. As Dolley Madison and her companions slipped into the night, the city's fate was still unwritten. The British could be heard, faint but certain, their progress marked by the glow of lanterns and the rumble of distant drums. She did not look back, The president's house, emptied and vulnerable, stood as a silent witness. Within its rooms the portrait of Washington was gone, the weight of the past carried out into darkness by hands loyal and uncelebrated. In years to come, Dolley's flight would become legend. Some would say she saved the soul of the nation, that her calm under fire was as crucial as any soldier's courage. Others would argue the story had grown in the telling, that myth and memory had woven together until truth was a flickering light, never still for long. Yet in that hour there was no myth, only a woman, a city on the edge, and the fierce, unspoken hope that something vital might survive the coming fire. Night had not yet claimed the city, though shadows stretched long across the avenues. The British arrived quietly, the way a storm sometimes does, not with fanfare, but with a certainty that overtakes everything else. Columns of red-coated soldiers wound their way past ruined gardens and splintered fences, boots silent in the gathering dusk, their faces set against the uncertain flicker of firelight beginning to crawl up the sky. No battle cry greeted them, no last stand, no orderly resistance. What awaited was emptiness, a city left to its own echoes. Doors hung open on their hinges. The president's house stood solitary atop its gentle hill, windows staring blankly toward the river. Grass was trampled on the lawn where a carriage had sped away only minutes earlier, wheels gouging new scars into the earth. The silence of abandonment greeted the British with an intimacy more unnerving than the chaos of battle. General Robert Ross, mounted and silent, was the first to approach. He dismounted without ceremony and stood for a moment, breathing the air, rich with smoke, tinged with the sweetness of late summer and the unmistakable bitterness of fear. Around him, his officers waited. They did not rush. These men had seen cities fall before: Lisbon, Madrid, Antwerp, Paris. Yet something in the hush of Washington seemed raw, more fragile. This was not Europe. This was a capital still half built, as if hope itself had been interrupted. Ross signalled with a gloved hand and his troops moved forward. The front door swung inward on protesting hinges, exposing a wide entrance hall lined with pale plaster, the light inside oddly soft. British boots clicked against the marble floor, echoing down corridors scented with beeswax, wood smoke, and something else. Something unfamiliar and vulnerable. They moved as conquerors, but also as curious guests. Soldiers paused to peer at the furnishings, the elaborate clocks, the unfamiliar portraits lining the walls. In the dining room, the long table remained set for supper. Linen napkins folded just so, crystal glasses catching what little light filtered through smoke-streaked windows. On one sideboard, a silver tray gleamed, its surface still scattered with crumbs from a meal abandoned in haste. The aroma of roast and spice lingered, an after-image of comfort. For a moment they were transfixed. It was a tableau of life interrupted, a place that still remembered laughter, conversation, the gentle clink of forks and plates. Some soldiers exchanged glances, uncertain whether to marvel or to mourn. A few sat at the table, lifting glasses in a parody of the absent host. Someone found a decanter of wine and poured for the others, the liquid splashing in the hush. It was not a scene of wild victory, but one of uncanny intimacy, a dinner party's ghost, and the living playing along for a few suspended minutes. Yet war does not leave such moments untouched. Soon the officers resumed their purpose. Orders were given in hushed tones. The looting began, but it was measured, almost ritualistic. Silver and china wrapped in military jackets, documents leafed through and then discarded, a few baubles pocketed by men who would not stay long. They examined the books in the small library, some lingering over titles, perhaps amused at the ideals and ambitions of this fledgling nation. Elsewhere in the house, soldiers moved through parlours and bedrooms. One took up Dolley Madison's abandoned harp and plucked a wavering note, its music fading almost before it began. In the master's study, a desk lay open, strewn with correspondence, a quill still wet beside a blot of spilled ink. A diary page fluttered on the floor, trampled and ignored. Every object seemed to vibrate with absence. The house was a stage, and its actors had all vanished just before the curtain fell. The men found little that was valuable by European standards. The true treasures, Madison's papers, the portrait of Washington, had already been spirited away. What remained was the residue of ordinary life, a child's toy tucked beneath a sofa, a pair of spectacles on a bedside table, a handkerchief left folded on a dressing stand. Some soldiers pocketed trinkets, more out of habit than greed. Others simply wandered, as if searching for something lost, or for a reason behind the violence they'd been ordered to commit. General Ross walked the halls alone for a time, his boots silent on the plush rugs. He paused at a window, gazing out over the garden where the scent of roses battled with the thickening smoke. In that moment he must have seen not only the present ruin, but also the vulnerability of dreams half-built and easily broken. The signal to burn the president's house was not given with a shout, but with the quiet certainty of orders that had already been decided elsewhere. Oil was brought, spilled across floorboards and piled drapes. Soldiers moved through the rooms, methodically laying the tools of destruction. It was not anger that guided them, but an obligation, a demonstration meant to echo far beyond these fragile walls. Before the fires were set, one officer, perhaps out of mischief or a sense of occasion, led a brief mocking toast in the dining room. British soldiers raised glasses in a silent salute, their faces caught between triumph and unease. They drank to the conquest of a capital, to a war far from home, to a night that would be remembered for its strangeness as much as for its destruction. The match was struck. Flames caught at the edges of curtains, crawling up velvet and silk. Smoke curled along the ceiling, chasing shadow into every corner. The scent of burning paper rose sharp and sudden as letters and ledgers, proclamations and bills, pages of the nation's story, were consumed in minutes. The fire, hungry and persistent, moved from room to room, devouring certainty, swallowing the gentle marks of life. Outside, the British watched as firelight spilled from the windows. It painted their faces in flickering gold, dancing across uniforms and weapons. The house that had stood as a symbol of hope was reduced to silhouette, its white columns glowing, then darkening as the flames gained strength. Somewhere nearby, an officer recorded in his diary, "We entered as men might enter a dream, and left as men leave a place where something has ended forever." The president's house, for all its history and promise, had become a pyre, its destruction echoing not only across the city, but through the corridors of memory, where it would burn in silence for years to come. The British lingered a while longer, moving through the city's empty avenues. They carried with them the smell of smoke, the residue of secrets left behind in the ash. Their work was not yet done. Other buildings would soon know the same fate. But for a moment they paused at the edge of the firelight, watching as dreams and symbols turned to ember and dust. When they moved on, the president's house was left to the mercy of the flames. Its story for that night was finished, written in smoke, witnessed by no one except those who would one day search for meaning in the silence after the fire. Once the match was struck, the city itself seemed to inhale. For a moment everything was still. a collective pause before the violence of flame. The president's house, its pale facade bathed in unnatural light, became a beacon for all that was being lost. The crackle of burning silk carried far into the night, weaving itself through empty streets and echoing off the broken stones of half-built monuments. The fire moved with a mind of its own, seeking out corners long untouched by sunlight. Curtains vanished in seconds, their bright patterns gone in a single sweep. On the grand staircase, banisters turned black and crumbled, the balusters groaning as heat warped the air. Windows shattered one by one, surrendering to the pressure and heat, sending glass raining down onto the darkened lawn. Flames reflected in each jagged shard, multiplying the destruction, making it impossible to tell where the blaze ended and the shadows began. Outside, the British soldiers watched. Some stood transfixed, faces painted with the orange of the fire, the gold of conquest, the sickly green of regret. Others turned away, their orders fulfilled, the weight of command grown suddenly heavy in their hands. Few spoke. There was little to say as the heart of a capital burned, and history itself seemed to buckle under the force of heat and memory. Within the house, objects surrendered with quiet dignity. Books curled in on themselves, their spines arching, pages fluttering like wings before turning to smoke. The painted ceilings fell, bit by bit, in slow, reluctant collapse. Silver melted, running in small rivulets along the scorched floor. The music room, once filled with laughter and gentle notes from Dolley Madison's harp, yielded to silence as the strings burned and snapped in the rising heat. Smoke billowed upward, carrying the scent of burning paper and singed roses. It rose above the city, gathering into the thick, low clouds that pressed against the stars. For those still hiding in cellars or crouched behind locked doors, the world shrank to the flicker of fire through window panes and the slow, patient advance of ash. Some prayed, murmuring old words in new fear. Others held hands, waiting for either the dawn or the end, whichever would arrive first. The fire did not remain contained within the president's house. Its hunger spread to the adjacent treasury, to the Capitol, to the Library of Congress with its fragile store of knowledge. At each new building, the process repeated. Doors broken open, oil poured along floors, a single torch pressed to the threshold. There was a ritual to it, almost a reverence, a recognition that what was being destroyed was more than brick and mortar, but the ideas that had held the city together, if only barely. The Capitol dome, incomplete and surrounded by scaffolding, caught fire in its own way. Wooden planks fed the flames, sending up sparks that drifted on the night wind. Marble columns cracked in the heat, giving way with reluctant sighs. In the library, volumes of law, poetry and science disappeared, their words rising in smoke above a city that had so briefly called itself the seat of government. Everywhere, the fire revealed new casualties. In the treasury, records of birth, marriage, and death crumpled into blackened scraps, names erased with the speed history rarely allows. Maps curled on themselves, their lines blurred and unreadable. In the Capitol's committee rooms, wax seals melted on letters never to be read, their contents surrendered to the hungry dark. It was not only the great buildings that suffered. Small houses along the avenue, homes for clerks and their families, caught the blaze and surrendered without protest. Gardens wilted in the heat. Old trees shed burning leaves, their branches alight with brief, terrible beauty. At the city's edge, the flames were less visible but no less feared. Residents who dared to look saw the sky painted the colour of old copper, streaked with the black of new grief. Among the ruins there were stories that would not be recorded in any ledger. A servant, risking everything, rescued a family Bible from a parlour already filling with smoke. A watchman at the Capitol tried in vain to save a cabinet of fossils, refusing to leave until the roof collapsed above him. In a darkened alley, a mother gathered her children close and hummed the tune of a hymn she could barely remember, the melody offering a fragile shelter from the roar outside. Yet there were also those who found opportunity in the fire. A handful of British soldiers, driven by impulse or avarice, carried away whatever they could find: silver spoons, a pair of candlesticks, a fine set of china. Some laughed, pouring wine from bottles unearthed in the president's cellars. Others took nothing, moving silently from room to room, as if searching for something neither tangible nor easily named. The soundscape was a shifting tapestry: roaring flame, breaking glass, distant shouts, the clatter of hooves on cobblestone as horses pulled away into the night. Occasionally thunder rumbled from the far horizon, a low warning that something else approached. The city, for all its pain, seemed to listen, the fire's voice rising to fill every empty chamber and every dark street. As the hours wore on, the city's heart grew darker. The British, their work complete, withdrew in stages, some to tents on the outskirts, others to churches and houses spared by accident or design. What remained behind was not silence, but the ongoing murmur of destruction, wood collapsing, embers settling, the last breaths of buildings too proud to fall quickly. In the stillness after the flames, the world felt thinner, stripped of the illusions that had given it shape. The city's ambitions, briefly illuminated by firelight, now lay hidden under layers of ash. Those who survived emerged slowly, uncertain, moving through streets transformed by loss. They picked through the debris, searching for any trace of what had come before: buttons, charred coins, a locket unopened, a book half burned and stubbornly legible. The night of fire became more than memory. It became the boundary between what had been and what would never return. Each burned room told a story, and each survivor carried away a handful of ashes, some for mourning, some for hope, all for remembrance. As the fire consumed the heart of the city, a different sound, sharper, deeper, and entirely unexpected, split the night. Not thunder, though the sky was thickening with the promise of storms, nor the ordinary shudder of collapsing timber. This was something else, a concussion that rattled window panes miles away and set birds shrieking from their midnight perches. For a moment, all other noise seemed to recede, leaving only the echo of that explosion and the sudden trembling silence that followed. The source was the Washington City Armory, a squat brick building set a little apart from the government's grander constructions. It was here that the American defenders had stored powder, shot, and the tools of war: stacks of muskets, barrels of black powder, crates of ammunition piled behind locked doors. Its thick walls had promised protection. But as with so much else in those hours, that promise was easily broken. The British had found the armory while moving through the city, guided by orders as old as war itself: deny the enemy what you cannot keep. A handful of soldiers entered the building, lighting torches to guide their search. Shadows flickered along the damp walls, glancing off stacks of weaponry and half-forgotten relics from other smaller conflicts. The men moved with purpose, though not without a certain caution. Every corner seemed ready to yield either treasure or danger. There are many stories about what happened next. Some say the soldiers, hurrying, spilled oil across a pile of powder kegs and failed to notice as it soaked deeper into the wood. Others claim the armory's keepers, fleeing at the last minute, left a slow-burning fuse behind, an act of desperation, a final attempt to deny their enemies the satisfaction of victory. There are even those who whisper that the building itself rebelled, its walls remembering all the anger and fear stored within. Whatever the cause, the effect was sudden and merciless. The powder ignited, and for a brief, blinding moment the city's night became as bright as day. A tower of flame and debris leapt into the sky, scattering burning timbers and fragments of brick across several blocks. The roar swallowed every other sound. The cries of the wounded, the commands of officers, the quiet weeping of those watching their lives go up in smoke. The shockwave knocked men from their feet, shattered windows in houses that had so far escaped the fire, sent carriages spinning and horses screaming into the dark. Even those who had grown numb to disaster found themselves shaken. British and American alike stumbled from the ruins, faces smeared with ash and confusion, eyes wide in disbelief. The explosion did not discriminate. Its violence belonged to no flag. Flames, already hungry, found new fuel in the wreckage, licking at splintered beams and shattered crates, feeding on spilled powder and tattered uniforms. Rumours grew in the firelit confusion. Some insisted it was sabotage, a final, spiteful gesture from the city's defenders. Others whispered of a supernatural hand, an omen sent by Providence or fate to warn the invaders that their victory was neither complete nor uncontested. The night seemed to pulse with old superstitions. It was said that a figure, cloaked in blue fire, had been seen running from the armory moments before the blast, his face hidden, his purpose unknown. In the aftermath, stories multiplied, each more feverish than the last. The boundaries between fact and fear dissolved in the smoke. The wounded were tended in the open air, on lawns and church steps, wherever there was room to lay them down. The city's doctors, those who had not fled, moved from one burned figure to another, offering water, prayers, and whatever aid their trembling hands could give. Soldiers stripped off their jackets to bandage wounds, their own uniforms marked by the night's violence. Voices rose and fell in half-whispered supplication. Pleas for help, for forgiveness, for deliverance from a nightmare that would not end before dawn. The explosion also carried far beyond Washington. Its thunder was heard across the river, in sleepy farms and taverns along the Virginia shore. Some believed an earthquake had struck, others feared the war had come at last to their doors. For hours afterward, people wandered out into their yards and fields, scanning the horizon for flames, for marching men, for the signal that life had changed in ways that could never be repaired. In the immediate aftermath, the British command paused. Some officers debated whether to press their destruction further, fearing that the city held other hidden traps. Others, shaken, withdrew a little from their work, watching the sky as if expecting more disasters to fall from above. The armory's destruction was a warning, deliberate or not. In the business of burning cities, no one controls the outcome, and no one walks away unmarked. Amid the scattered debris, small moments of humanity emerged. A British private, separated from his unit, knelt beside a wounded American he'd found half buried in the rubble. He offered water, his own canteen emptied one careful sip at a time. A girl, no more than 12, crept from her family's cellar and picked her way through the cooling embers, searching for the locket she had dropped when the first boom shook her from her sleep. The city's churches, spared by the initial fires, threw open their doors to the lost, the frightened, the suddenly homeless. As dawn neared, the world inside Washington seemed more ghostly than ever. Soot drifted on the breeze, catching in the hollows of ruined doorways and the folds of torn banners. The air tasted of salt and iron, the city's own wounds refusing to heal. By morning, the armory's ruins had settled into uneasy silence. The British moved off, their orders fulfilled, their spirits tempered by a night in which even the victors were not spared the reach of catastrophe. For those left behind, the blast became another point of mystery, a wound within a wound. Some would insist for years after that the explosion was no accident. Others preferred to forget the moment entirely, burying the memory beneath layers of more ordinary sorrow. But on that night, when the city burned and thundered and mourned, the blast at the armory wrote itself into the story of survival, a reminder that, in the chaos of history, even the tools of protection can become the seeds of ruin. And as the last embers cooled and the birds began to sing once more, Washington remained, a little smaller, a little greyer, but somehow still standing, still haunted by the memory of that sudden, impossible fire. The fires had been burning for hours when the air began to change. At first it was a subtle shift, an uneasiness in the way smoke moved across the sky, a restlessness among the trees as if the city's pain called something down from above. Few noticed it at first. Their attention was fixed on the red-lit windows, the blackened shells of monuments, and the persistent taste of ash that settled on the tongue. But the storm was coming, drawn as if by the heat of destruction, or the grief of the land itself. Some would later say it arrived without warning, though others remembered old signs. The sudden silence of birds, a heaviness to the air, the way flames seemed to flicker sideways as if flinching from an invisible hand. For those wandering the ruined streets, British soldiers, American survivors, families clutching what little they had saved, the weather became another actor in the drama, inscrutable and absolute. A breeze sprang up from the river, cool and sharp, scattering embers and pressing smoke low to the ground. With it came the first distant rumbles, low, uncertain, easily mistaken for more explosions. Then the wind gained voice, whistling through alleys, snapping flags that still clung to shattered flagpoles. The air, thick with the scent of burning wood and melting tar, now held the promise of rain, a perfume both sweet and dangerous. It began with a single drop, then another and another. The dust on the cobbles turned dark, little islands of wetness appearing amidst the grey. For a moment the fire seemed to fight back, leaping higher as if defying the heavens to quench its hunger. But the rain grew stronger, falling in uneven sheets, hissing where it struck the hottest ruins. British soldiers scattered through the city raised their faces to the sky, surprise and relief mingling on their soot-streaked skin. The wind became a gale. Trees along the avenues bent nearly double, their branches thrashing as if trying to uproot themselves and flee. Lightning flickered behind heavy clouds, illuminating the ruins in stark, unnatural bursts. The thunder that followed rolled low and unbroken, shaking the city to its bones, making even the boldest men flinch. In one sudden moment, the storm and the fire met, two ancient adversaries locked in silent contest over the fate of Washington. Eyewitnesses described a tempest unlike any they had seen. Some called it a hurricane, others a tornado. Roofs were torn from buildings, timbers sent flying through the air like spears. The fire was beaten back in places, smothered by the sheets of rain, yet in other corners it raged all the fiercer, fanned by the storm's breath. Debris whirled through the streets, charred shingles, shattered glass, fragments of official papers lifted skyward, their words lost to the wind. In the president's house, what was left of the grand portico crumbled under the assault. Water poured down staircases blackened by soot. mixing with pools of melted wax and the last remains of books and ledgers. In the capital, flames hissed and died beneath collapsed rafters, while outside the bronze statue of freedom, unmoved by disaster, gathered rainwater in cupped, outstretched hands. The British, momentarily victorious, now found themselves hunted by the very weather that seemed to have conspired with the city's defenders. Some took shelter in doorways and ruined churches, huddling beneath torn cloaks, their muskets useless in the deluge. Others ran blindly through the streets, slipping on wet cobbles, chased by gusts that seemed almost to possess intent. It was as if the city itself had risen up. Having been denied the chance to fight, it called down the heavens to do its bidding. There were stories, passed in hurried whispers long after, of a great whirlwind spinning out of the heart of the storm. Some said it swept through Pennsylvania Avenue, scattering the British in its path, tossing wagons and uprooting trees as if they weighed nothing at all. A few claimed to have seen figures within the whirlwind, faces from another time, or perhaps only tricks of the firelit dark. In those hours, anything seemed possible. History, superstition, and terror became one. Yet not all who witnessed the storm felt fear. For the survivors, those huddled in cellars, pressed close in ruined kitchens, clutching children or relics of their former lives, the rain became a kind of blessing. It cooled the skin, cleansed wounds, carried away the ash and acrid smoke that had made breathing near impossible. Some crept out beneath the storm's shadow, lifting buckets to catch the rain, weeping not from grief, but from the simple relief of water on their faces. There was a moment, brief and unforgettable, when the wind seemed to die as suddenly as it had arrived. In the lull, the world was rendered silent. Smoke and mist twined together over the ruined city, veiling what was left in ghostly grey. For the first time since the burning began, the air was fresh, almost sweet. A robin sang from a battered branch, its song small, persistent, and deeply out of place. As dawn approached, the last of the storm moved off toward the east, leaving behind puddles that mirrored the ruined buildings, and streets littered with debris and drowned embers. British soldiers gathered what remained of their ranks, some shaken, others grimly determined to finish their orders before retreating. The Americans, stunned by the chain of calamities, stumbled from hiding to take stock of what had survived. No one who lived through that night would ever agree on what exactly they had witnessed. Was the storm merely chance, summoned by the laws of weather and the accident of geography? Or was it something more, a force awakened by the city's suffering, an act of providence or warning that history itself would debate for generations? In the city's memory, the storm became legend. It was said to have saved what little remained, to have punished the invaders, to have marked the event with the unmistakable stamp of the extraordinary. Some would say the storm was the true hero of Washington, the hand that preserved enough to begin again. Yet when the sun finally broke through, weak and gold, it fell upon a city transformed by fire, by violence, by rain. All that was left was silence, and the unsteady promise that something new might one day rise from the sodden ashes. In the days that followed, the city took its first tentative steps toward renewal. Plaster was mixed, nails scavenged from fallen beams. Letters were sent to family members far away, describing both the devastation and the first signs of healing. In the evenings, survivors gathered on porches and in gardens, sharing stories that had already begun to shift from fact to legend. Through all of this, the ashes remained. They dusted the streets, settled in the seams of clothing, floated on the river's slow current. Children traced words in them, their fingers leaving trails that marked the beginning of new stories. The city was changed, but not ended. In every act of escape, whether from fire, fear, or despair, there was the faintest shimmer of something like redemption. When night came again, it was quieter than before. The stars seemed brighter, the air less heavy. A handful of candles flickered in windows, defiant and uncertain. In their light, Washington's survivors looked to the future, uncertain but unbroken, bound together by the memory of fire and the promise that, in time, the city would rise again. For the British, the escape from Washington was not without peril. As they marched back toward their ships, the storm harried them. Trees blocked their path. Floodwaters rose, threatening to trap them in unfamiliar terrain. There were stories of men lost to the swollen rivers, of supplies abandoned in haste, of columns separated by the chaos of wind and rain. Their victory, so complete the night before, seemed now to unravel at the edges. As the sun rose higher, survivors gathered in the heart of the ruined city. Some began to clear debris, forming impromptu crews of neighbours and strangers. They righted toppled stones, salvaged ironwork, and swept the streets with stiff bristled brooms found among the wreckage. Others knelt in prayer, giving thanks for their deliverance or asking forgiveness for what could not be undone. Their voices rose together, a mingling of lament and hope, echoing off the empty facades. There were moments of unexpected mercy. Rainwater collected in barrels offered clean drink for those who'd not slept or eaten in 2 days. Neighbours who had rarely spoken before shared bread and dry blankets, forging alliances born of necessity and sorrow. In the quiet, the city's pulse returned, faint but insistent. News of the burning travelled quickly. Riders carried word to Baltimore and Philadelphia, their reports tinged with disbelief. In taverns and parlour rooms across the country, people argued over what the loss meant, whether the nation could recover, whether the British would return, whether anything sacred remained. Some cursed the government for its failures, others blamed fate or providence or their own complacency. The story grew in the telling, each retelling sharpening the outlines of fear and resolve. At the centre of the devastation, Dolley Madison returned. She picked her way through fallen beams and pools of water, her skirt hem-blackened, her eyes taking in every detail. The president's house stood hollow, its walls gutted, roof open to the sky. She paused before the spot where Washington's portrait had once hung, imagining the brushstrokes, the solemn gaze, the stories carried out in darkness by loyal hands. She found no comfort in the ruins, yet she did not turn away. She walked each corridor, her hands brushing soot from marble, her presence a promise that the story was not yet over. Other survivors moved through the city with similar resolve. They searched for loved ones, calling names into alleyways and shattered courtyards. They dug through debris with bare hands, hoping to find anything left intact. A photograph, a locket, a book with pages unburned. Some wept openly, their grief echoing beneath the broken dome of the Capitol. Others stood in silence, the enormity of loss settling on their shoulders like a weight they could not set down. For a time, people moved like sleepwalkers. Some gathered in churchyards, heads bent in silent prayers, the walls around them scarred but still standing. Others wandered through the ruins, their faces set and eyes searching for the familiar. A garden gate spared by the flames, a teacup unbroken on a mantelpiece, the faint outline of a handprint on soot-stained wallpaper. In every search there was hope, flickering, stubborn, impossible to quench. From the ashes, stories began to stir. A housemaid found her employer's signet ring in the blackened earth and pressed it to her lips, grateful for something solid in a world gone strange. Two boys, dirt-streaked and barefoot, chased a scrap of paper through the ruins. When they caught it, they read aloud the list of names it bore, reciting each as if summoning the city back into being. Old men gathered near the river, speaking in hushed tones about storms and fire and the caprice of fate. Their voices mixed with the lapping of water and the distant call of crows. Not all in their ranks felt the same triumph. Some glanced back over their shoulders, eyes lingering on the blackened bones of the president's house and the scorched columns of the Capitol. It is one thing to conquer, another to witness the remains of what was conquered, the human cost inscribed on every ruined wall. They did not linger. The city was not for them to keep, nor to mourn. In their wake, silence pressed in from every direction. The city was left to those who had survived: clerks, servants, soldiers, widows, and the too young who had watched their world collapse from behind shuttered windows. They emerged cautiously, blinking in the watery light. The ground was uneven, strewn with debris both monumental and intimate: a burned child's shoe, a melted button, a scorched Bible with only the edges of psalms still legible. Dawn crept slowly across the battered fields, its light diffused by mist and the lingering haze of smoke. For the first time in days, the wind quieted, leaving the city suspended in a fragile stillness. The world was washed clean and wrecked at once, ruins glistening with rain, embers whispering beneath collapsed beams, and puddles reflecting the ghostly outline of what had once been. The British, their purpose fulfilled, began their slow withdrawal from the city. They moved through streets that had become unrecognisable, their boots splashing through mud and ash. Some left with trophies: a silver cup, a letterhead stamped with the seal of a government now vanished. Others carried nothing at all, walking with heads bowed, haunted by memories that would follow them for years. The wind tugged at their uniforms, the scent of wet earth and cinders trailing them out of the Capitol and back toward the Potomac's restless banks. In the weeks that followed, the city took on a strange, haunted beauty. Rain fell more often, softening the jagged lines of destruction. Grass pushed through cracks in the pavements, a silent reclamation. Where there had been flames, now only smoke-smudged stones and scattered relics remained. Yet beneath the ash, legends began to root, stories traded in whispers and long silences, stories that would linger far longer than the ruins themselves. Children, spared the worst, turned the wreckage into a landscape of adventure. They balanced atop toppled columns, fashioned swords from burnt laths, and told each other tales of what the British had done, tales that grew stranger with each retelling. A ghost walked the halls of the president's house, some insisted, and it was he who summoned the storm. Others spoke of the portrait of Washington, rescued at the last moment, protected not by men but by the stubborn will of the first president himself. In this new mythology, courage and chance braided together, inseparable and eternal. Dolley Madison's actions, too, began to acquire the shape of legend. Neighbours recounted how she refused to flee until the portrait was safe, how she urged the servants on with calm assurance, how she wrote letters in the final hour. Each detail embellished, polished, and passed from one household to another. Some described her as a heroine, others as a figure from old epics weaving destiny with her bare hands. In the absence of certainty, her story became the city's hope, proof that dignity could survive even the wildest storm. In taverns and parlours, the tale of the great tornado swelled. Patrons recalled how the wind tore roofs from houses, how it lifted wagons and soldiers alike, how it snatched the flames from the very hands of the British and cast them down in ruin. Some swore they saw figures in the clouds, ancient warriors or angels in blue coats, or the spirit of Washington himself. Skeptics dismissed these stories with a wave, yet none could quite explain how a fire so fierce was quenched so quickly, or why the invaders retreated in such haste. Others found meaning in quieter signs. A woman discovered her wedding ring, blackened but unbroken, beneath the scorched floorboards of her parlour. An apprentice printer uncovered a half-burned pamphlet, its last words urging perseverance in the face of darkness. A boy retrieved a battered hymn book from the ashes of his church and sang its songs at twilight, his voice a thin, persistent thread weaving past and present together. Ghosts, it was said, now wandered the city at night. Some claimed to see spectral soldiers pacing the avenues, musket in hand, searching for orders that would never come. In the hollowed halls of the capital, more than one caretaker reported the sensation of unseen eyes, a chill that lingered even as the last embers died. The boundaries between the living and the lost seemed thinner now, as if the fire had burned away not just wood and stone, but also the usual divisions of time. Rumours reached beyond Washington. In distant towns, news of the burning arrived half true and half imagined. Some believed the entire government was lost, others that the president himself had died in the flames. Each retelling layered new details. A midnight duel between British officers in the ruined rotunda. A secret cache of documents spirited away by slaves. Before the fire reached the archives, a prophecy, hastily scrawled on the wall of the treasury, foretelling the city's eventual rebirth. Within the ruins, the seeds of resilience took hold. Churches reopened with broken windows and pews blackened by soot. The bells, long silent, rang out over the rubble, their notes thin but unmistakable. The first new walls were raised not with ceremony, but with quiet determination. Brick laid atop brick, nails hammered into scorched beams, the rhythm of rebuilding replacing the clamour of fear. Among the survivors, Dolley Madison became a figure of solace. She moved through neighbourhoods, visiting the displaced, sharing what little she'd managed to save. Her calm was a balm, her presence proof that the past had not been wholly erased. People pressed tokens into her hands, a bit of lace, a lock of hair, a letter singed at the edges, as if offering tribute to the memory she represented. Songs emerged, sung in backyards and at work sites, low and steady. The White House burns, the storm it turns, but hope is never gone. Children carved names into new doorframes, each letter a vow that they would not be swept away. Mothers wrote to distant kin, describing the city's scars and its stubborn pulse. In every act of remembrance, in every tale retold, the city stitched itself back together. With the passing days, the ruins themselves became sites of pilgrimage. Families gathered at the shell of the president's house to leave flowers, to touch the blackened stones, to whisper prayers for those who had fled or fallen. Some spoke of feeling watched, protected, or even forgiven. The line between survivor and witness blurred, and everyone became both. As the city rebuilt, its identity shifted. The burning and the storm became more than a disaster. They became the city's legend, its new heart. The anthem that would soon echo from Baltimore's ramparts, the Star-Spangled Banner, found its roots in these ruins, its words forged in the same fire and tempered by the same storm. Hope, battered but unbroken, rang through every verse. In time, the White House would be restored. New timbers would replace the burned, new paint would cover the scars. But the stories would remain. etched in memory, sung in the evening, whispered by the wind through trees that had survived it all. The city's children would grow up tracing footsteps through the grass, asking about ghosts and portraits and the night the sky itself seemed to descend. Not everything was rebuilt, nor every question answered. Some stories drifted on the wind, changing shape as they pass from one generation to the next. Yet in every retelling, the spirit of that night lived on, not merely a tale of burning and ruin, but a reminder that legends rise from ashes and that what is lost is never wholly gone. Long after the fires cooled, the burning of Washington lingered like a bruise, deep, persistent, and impossible to hide. In parlours and meeting halls, on the pages of newspapers, and in the midnight silence of private chambers, the memory pressed in. For a nation barely 30 years old, the spectacle of foreign soldiers dining in the president's house, then reducing it to ashes, was more than a military loss. It was an open wound, raw and aching, that spread through the spirit of the country. The humiliation shaped every conversation, public and private. In the weeks that followed, letters crossed the continent, heavy with anger and confusion. How could this happen, one senator wrote? What shadows were we living under, not to see the danger before it was too late? Sermons thundered from pulpits. Divine judgment, some preachers declared, had come upon a nation that had lost its way. Others urged forgiveness and renewal, weaving the disaster into the fabric of an emerging civil religion, one that worshipped not just God, but the myth of American endurance. In the capital itself, the ruins became a gathering point for reflection and resolve. Men in scorched coats and women in soot-streaked shawls walked the shattered avenues, searching for scraps of hope among the wreckage. They knelt in the remains of the Capitol and prayed for guidance, asking for wisdom to rebuild what had been lost. Grief, mingled with determination, took root in their hearts. Yet humiliation did not bring only sorrow. It awakened a restless energy. The American government, its leaders chastened, its people watchful, began to reconsider what it meant to be vulnerable. New plans were drawn up with trembling urgency. Fortifications on the Potomac, expanded militias, armories placed far from the reach of foreign guns. The president, once criticized for indecision, now spoke with a new gravity. James Madison's face, lined with fatigue, appeared in public more often, the lines around his eyes speaking to both loss and the burden of leadership. Across the country, newspapers raged and rallied in equal measure. Some condemned the military failures that had allowed the capital to fall. Others called for unity, invoking the language of family and home. Political cartoons, crude, biting, circulated in taverns, lampooning generals and speculating on the motives of distant allies. The flames of the White House burned again in print, each depiction both a warning and a challenge. Children, too young to grasp the full weight of defeat, grew up in a world reshaped by stories of fire and shame. Their games, played among the ruins and rebuilt streets, echoed the struggles of grown men. Wooden swords clashed in mock battles as the city's future fought to reclaim its innocence. In their laughter, there was both forgetting and remembrance, a need to move forward even as the past clung to every stone. From the ashes, new symbols arose. The flag that had been trampled and torn during the burning of Washington was sewn anew, its stars and stripes stitched by hands still trembling from loss. Songs were composed, first mournful, then defiant. In Baltimore, just weeks after the disaster, another British attack would inspire Francis Scott Key to pen the words that would become the Star-Spangled Banner. a hymn not just to a flag, but to a country's refusal to let humiliation have the last word. The burning of the White House also marked a turning point in the war itself. The American army, shamed into action, began to fight with a fierceness born of desperation. Militia units that had scattered at Bladensburg returned with renewed resolve, defending their homes with a stubbornness the British had not anticipated. In the chaos that followed, new leaders emerged, some remembered, many forgotten, each bearing the imprint of that night's lessons. Yet for all the resolve, the city's wound did not heal quickly. The scars were visible in every rebuilt wall, every salvaged stone. The president's house, when it was restored, bore the faint shadow of fire along its foundations. Some said that on certain evenings the scent of smoke still drifted through its corridors, a lingering reminder of vulnerability and shame. Public memory is a strange and shifting thing. Over the years, the story of the burning became both cautionary tale and origin myth. In some tellings, it was a tragedy brought on by complacency and arrogance. In others, it was a necessary trial, the fire that forged a stronger nation. School children learned to recite the dates and names, but it was in the quiet spaces, family tables, church pews, the dim lamplight of libraries, that the real lessons settled in. Each anniversary brought its own rituals. Wreaths were laid on the site of the old armoury, prayers spoken for the souls lost to flame and violence. The tale was told anew, how a city had burned and survived, how shame had been transformed, slowly and imperfectly, into a kind of pride. Those who remembered that summer, the stench of smoke, the taste of rain, the silence that followed the storm, carried its lessons into every corner of their lives. For some, the echo of humiliation became a quiet strength. It was a knowledge that safety could vanish in a single night, that leadership required both humility and courage. It was the understanding that in the face of ruin, the only true response is to gather what is left, hold tight to memory and begin again. And so, year by year, the city remade itself, not in spite of the fire, but because of it. The president's house stood rebuilt, its white walls brighter against the memory of ash. The Capitol dome rose, gleaming, a promise that something fragile could endure. The anthems sung in Baltimore drifted on the wind, reaching every corner of a country still learning what it meant to be whole. Even now, when dusk falls over Washington and the first lamps glow in the gathering dark, there is a hush, a sense of history breathing just beneath the surface. The city remembers. The country remembers. In every echo, in every silence, the lessons of that night return. Humiliation, endurance, and the quiet conviction that what is lost can be mourned and still become the foundation of something new. In the burned-out silence that followed the British departure, Washington became a city alive with rumours. The visible wounds of fire and storm were easy enough to account for. But what truly unsettled survivors, and those who heard the story second and third hand, were the mysteries that had not been solved, questions that seemed to multiply in the shadows of the ruined streets. People spoke in hushed voices, certain there was more to the disaster than chance and carelessness. Some insisted that the British victory was only possible because someone inside the city had betrayed it. In the crowded markets of Georgetown and the quiet corners of church basements, neighbours whispered about traitors moving through the highest circles of government, about messages slipped under doors, coded signals flashed from upper windows on the night before the attack. Suspicion landed on men who had left just before the enemy arrived, on officials who'd been too slow with warnings, on the inexplicable way that vital roads seemed clear of defenders at the crucial moment. There were those who believed the defeat was orchestrated from within for reasons more obscure than politics. Old wounds from the Revolution, lingering British sympathies, rivalries between North and South. All these were said to have combined in a storm of secret motives. Stories circulated of prominent families whose loyalty was never truly tested, of merchants whose fortunes rose as the city's ashes cooled. Conspiracy, in the absence of certainty, became a kind of comfort, a way to believe there must be design, if only a dark one, behind so much destruction. Some pointed to the almost supernatural timing of the British attack and the storm that followed. The tempest had come just as the fires reached their fiercest, as if summoned by prayer or design. Letters found years later, buried in archives and desk drawers, speculated about experiments gone wrong, a hidden weapon perhaps, or a device intended to protect the city but turned suddenly against it. These whispers fed on one another, growing wilder in the retelling. Masonic symbols carved into stones, seen by a few watchmen and masons who picked through the rubble, became the focus of even deeper suspicions. Had the burning been allowed, or even invited by a hidden fraternity for some ritual purpose? Had a secret society with roots on both sides of the Atlantic signalled the British with an ancient sign? The evidence was always thin, the truth always just out of reach. But the stories clung to the night air, drifting in the spaces where faith and fact fell silent. Even Dolley Madison, that most practical of heroines, was woven into some of the stranger tales. Was her insistence on saving Washington's portrait a sign that she knew something others did not? Was there a coded message in her hasty letters to her sister and friends, meant for eyes beyond the family? Some whispered that she had received a warning in the days before the fire. A letter slipped under her door, inked in a hand she could not recognize, urging her to prepare. These rumours too flourished, for in the ruins there is always room for mystery. The storm itself, with its sudden force and uncanny timing, became a vessel for all manner of speculation. In some retellings, it was an act of divine intervention, a punishment or a rescue sent by God. Ministers seized on the event, preaching that the tempest was either retribution for national sins or a miracle that prevented greater loss. Others, less devout, wondered if the British, whose empire was rumoured to have dabbled in strange sciences, had unleashed the storm by design. Did their ships, anchored in the river, carry machines to change the weather, as a few European pamphlets had suggested? In the glow of shattered lanterns, such questions did not seem so impossible. Other theories grew more personal. Families who lost homes and livelihoods remembered strange visitors on the eve of destruction, strangers asking pointed questions, men in unfamiliar uniforms passing through the city's gates at dusk, shadows moving where no one should have been. Did the city's own defenders allow the British an easy path? Did someone profit from the chaos? The answer was never clear, but suspicion was a seed that needed little encouragement to grow. The ruins themselves offered odd evidence. A ledger, half burned, recorded supplies moved in and out of the city, but with pages missing from the days before the invasion. An officer's sword was found in a garden, its blade bent and strange stains on the hilt. Had there been a fight among the defenders, a dispute covered over by official silence? In the shell of the treasury, graffiti scrawled in coal-listed names that no one could recall. Signatures perhaps of men who vanished when the smoke cleared. As years passed, these whispers hardened into folklore. Visitors to the rebuilt White House reported cold spots and unexplained footsteps, as if the house remembered more than it cared to reveal. In the capital, a night watchman claimed to hear voices in languages he could not place, echoing down the empty corridors long after midnight. A handful of British veterans, in their memoirs, described feeling watched as they moved through the city, as if the land itself resented their presence and waited for revenge. Historians dismissed most of these stories, preferring documents and dates to ghosts and riddles. Yet even the most careful scholars admitted the record was incomplete. Some papers vanished without explanation. Others, referenced in old letters, were never found. The boundary between official fact and uneasy suspicion blurred in the smoky half-light of memory. It is always the nature of disaster to breed mystery. Catastrophe strips away certainty, revealing the darkness beneath. People reach for patterns, for meaning, for hidden hands that might explain the inexplicable. In the long, uncertain nights after the burning, Washington survivors told and retold these stories, not because they believed every word, but because the act of wondering offered a kind of solace. And so, the city rebuilt itself on a foundation of both fact and fiction. The fire and the storm, the betrayals and the bravery, the ghosts and the conspiracies, all became part of a single, endless story, one that outlived its witnesses and changed with every telling. In the ashes there are always secrets, waiting for someone to look closely, to listen for what still moves beneath the rubble and the silence. In every city, every century, the questions remain. What did we miss? Who pulled the strings? And what, if anything, was meant to survive? The city wakes, as it always has, beneath the pale hush of morning. Ash dust the stones, the old trees, the bent iron fences, settling in creases of memory and promise. The fire is long gone, but its echo lingers, a shape pressed into the bones of Washington, a ghost behind new paint and rebuilt walls. Time has done its work. The White House stands again, white as legend, proud as myth. The Capitol dome gleams in sunlight, columns unbowed, the marble steps worn by centuries of hurried feet. Yet for all the brightness, there are shadows no daylight can erase. They live in the mortar and the marble, in the names etched beneath new plaques, in the silence that falls over Pennsylvania Avenue when the world's attention turns elsewhere. The survivors of that long night are gone now, their voices faded into pages and song, into diary entries written by candlelight. But the questions they carried still wander the streets at dusk. Was it failure that brought the fire, or fate? Did betrayal slip through these corridors? Or was it only the familiar blindness of hope that kept the warnings muffled, the doors unbarred? Legends collect in the low places. They hide behind curtains, in attics, in the corners of meeting rooms where important men once wept or whispered or made promises no one could keep. Some stories say the White House is never entirely empty after dark, that on certain storm-swept nights you can hear the faint tread of boots, the flick of silk skirts, the scent of rain mingled with old smoke. The city remembers, even when it pretends to forget. Historians come with their ledgers and maps, their careful notations, their patience for sifting evidence from the silt of rumour. They find contradictions, gaps, clues lost to fire or carelessness. What cannot be proven is quietly set aside. But in the dreaming hours, those fragile minutes just before sleep, there is room for uncertainty. There the storm and the fire meet again, circling each other in the hush, asking what could have been changed, what might have been spared, and what mysteries are best left in shadow. Out of the devastation rose more than new buildings. There was a song written beside the rocket's red glare, that would become a hymn for the uncertain and the unbroken. There was a new shape to pride, one not untouched by loss, but strengthened by it, coloured by the memory of burning and the taste of rain. There was, in every new wall, a quiet acknowledgement of how quickly certainty can vanish, how fragile even the grandest hopes. For those who survived, the fire marked a beginning as much as an end. It showed what could be lost in a single night, and what stubbornness, grace, and a little luck might save. It bound the city together, not only in grief, but in the silent agreement to try again. With every stone raised, every law debated, every flag stitched and flown, there was a remembrance of the old wound, and a whisper of gratitude for what was spared. What remains after the fire is not only ruin, but resilience. Not only silence, but the soft persistence of stories that refuse to die. Every city has its shadows, its unanswered questions, its ghosts in the early hours. Washington is no different. The White House, beneath its painted facade, carries the memory of that night like a secret. The Capitol's echo holds a warning and a promise, twinned like night and dawn. Perhaps that is all history truly gives us. Not solutions, but reminders. That every age is built atop the ashes of another. That every comfort was once a risk. That every silence holds both sorrow and survival. Thank you for wandering with us through the flames and the thunder, through what was lost and what remains. Here, in the hush before sleep, the story is not closed. It drifts onward, unfinished, unresolved, a thread of smoke rising quietly toward the morning.